Well, it's of no surprise to learn that once again, the right do have love of certain things, even though, as they try to admit it, they do love certain things. And one of the things is that they love budget deficits. So this is from the New Statesman. Let's try that again. This is from the New Statesman, and it's how the right learn to love budget deficits. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump's embrace of higher public spending shows that austerity was always a choice rather than a necessity, which we've always said on this channel right from the start. Austerity was never needed in this country. We would be in a better place in this country if we had invested rather than decided to constantly save and cut back, which has only gone and damaged so many services that many rely on in this country, and have had to resort to things like food banks, which it should be a national humiliation to us that so many of our people, not only out of work but in work as well, have to resort to food banks to be able to feed themselves. So, for years on both sides of the Atlantic, the right berated the left for its economic irresponsibility. In the UK, the Conservatives vowed to maintain austerity until a budget surplus had been achieved. In the US, Republicans denounced Barack Obama's as a relentless spendthrift. The national debt, the state majority leader Mitch McConnell warned in 2012, was the nation's most serious long-term problem. And yet, in the UK and the US, budget deficits are once more rising at the behest of the right-wing administrations. In the first 4 months of its fiscal year, the British government borrowing and increased by more than 60% compared to the same period in 2018. But in his first spending review as Chancellor, Sajid David announced a 4.1 rise in expenditure, the largest increase in spending for 15 years, including the 3.1% for health, 3.3% for education, and 6.3% for the Home Office. For the first time the Conservatives entered into office in 2010, no government department will endure cuts. The deficit, as Javid reasonably noted, stood at just 1.1% of GDP last year, down from 9.9% in 2010. The lowest level since 2002. But the once cherished ambition of a budget surplus has been abandoned, even as the national debt stands at 82.4% of the GDP. Now, just as George Osborne's Keynesian opponents once did, Javid argues that the ultra-low government borrowing cost, which is below 1%, means that the state can afford to expand and invest. Austerity, he has tactically conceded, was always more of a choice than a necessity. Donald Trump, meanwhile, once vowed to eliminate the US's 19 trillion national debt over a period of 8 years, having branded Obama the most prolific deficit and debt spender in our nation's history. But in office, he has proved unable to resist the lure of borrowing. Under Trump, the deficit has swelled to 4%, its highest level since 2012, after dramatic cuts in taxes on the wealthy and corporations and a surge in military spending. The national debt is set to rise by 1.7 trillion over the next decade, reaching at about 95% of the GDP, its highest level since the aftermath of the Second World War. The budget deal is phenomenal. Go for it, Republicans. There's always plenty of time to cut, Trump declared, talking at an Augustinian approach to public spending. Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. For both the Conservatives and the Republicans, fiscal conservatism has been subordinated to projects of national greatness. Brexit and Make America Great Again. As Trump and Johnson know, after the slowest economic recovery in history, there are few votes in budgetary restraint. One could call it reactionary Keynesianism, higher public spending for the right wing rather than the liberal or socialist ends. Yet, in some respects, Trump and Johnson are merely replicating historical patterns. The Republican Party has long preached fiscal conservatism but practiced fiscal activism. Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush both presided over higher budget deficits after slashing taxes and ramping up military spending. It was a Democrat, Bill Clinton, who in 1998 achieved the first US budget surplus since 1969, a surplus of 2.3%, which would later become a deficit of 4.3% under Bush. Similarly, in the UK, Labour governments have, on average, been more fiscally restrained than their Conservative equivalents. The last surplus, which was 1.7%, was achieved at New Labour's height in the 2000 to 2001. Osborne's frugal reputation was undermined by a lax approach to his own targets. In its hazardous political and economic consequences, austerity contains the seeds for its own destruction. For the states that can borrow on their own currencies, as the UK and the US can, in which retain national leaders of last resort, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, there are few economic incentives to pursue cuts. It is not only the US and the UK that are revising their fiscal status. Even in Germany, where budget surplus have become a point of national pride, politicians and economists are debating whether to abandon the Schwarz Null, or Black Zero, as John Fuhrman, who chaired the Council of Economic Advisers under Obama, recently observed. I can't think of a place in a world today where the argument for fiscal stimulus is stronger than it is for Germany. The economy is in danger of recession after shrinking by 0.1%, and the most recent quarter, and Germany's export-based growth model has been hindered by the US-Chinese trade war. After a decade in which central banks assumed that the leading role in promoting growth, the Leviathan state is finally rising from the depths, but it will take more than a few years of plenty to compensate for years of famine. And this is exactly the state we're in. Now, what's going to happen? Well, for starters, at least the Conservatives have seemed to now admit that austerity was a choice. And it was an incredibly damaging choice because it has only gone to prove the most harmful to the most worst off in our society. And that really cannot be forgiven, no matter if you were affected or even if you weren't affected. The fact that this was inflicted on people for economic decisions that were not theirs to begin with, or their fault because it was brought on by the 2008 crash, or all this austerity nonsense, we are now in a position where they are now, well, we could have spent all this stuff, but no. And now we are in a very interesting position going forward because we are very likely to hit a general election. And ultimately, what happens now is that money has to be put back into these services. They have to be provided. And the other thing that we are going to have to certainly see in the UK, is that we are going to have a lot higher tax rate for corporations and especially on the rich, because they're the ones who have all the money. For starters, the European Union's tax avoidance directive will be an amazing step forward because now all these gigantic companies can no longer go and hide their wealth overseas. The meme that it's actually Switzerland is the most, financially dodgy place in Europe is actually wrong. It's London that is the most financially dodgy place in the world and in Europe. So again, this is one of the things that drove Brexit. This is why the elites are financing Brexit, because they don't want to pay an extra £1 million a year in tax. That's it. That's one of the big drivers of Brexit. That's why all these rich and wealthy elites, that's why Nigel Farage is pushing for Brexit, because even he doesn't want to pay his extra tax, which when you think about it, tax is the most patriotic thing you can do. Paying back into a country and a society that helped to raise you and get to you the position that you are today. Paying into the National Health Service, the police, fire, the NHS, you name it. All these public services are in danger because of the Conservatives' absolute insistence that austerity was the way to go when you have many countries, Canada, Iceland, I think it was Denmark, Sweden, and Norway also. There are other countries as well that went this direction as well. All showed that they were the fastest countries to recover economically because instead of cutting, they decided to invest. And that is one thing that we didn't do, and that is one thing this country desperately needs. And one of the institutions that can help us with that, and surprise, surprise, is the EU. So